What began as a single social media post has erupted into a geopolitical flashpoint with consequences far beyond headlines. A threat by former U.S. President Donald Trump to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods has shaken markets, strained alliances, and exposed the fragility of North America's economic order. Officially, the dispute centers on Canada's limited trade engagement with China. Unofficially, it reveals something deeper, a battle over control, dependency, and influence. As Canada charts a more independent economic path under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the question is no longer just about tariffs, but about whether intimidation still works in a world that is quietly changing. The United States, power, panic, and the cost of coercion. The tariff threat did not emerge from careful policy deliberation. It arrived abruptly, publicly, and without nuance. A blanket 100% tariff on all Canadian goods, unprecedented between two deeply integrated economies, was framed as a warning. But beneath the language of protection and national interest, the move exposed a growing vulnerability in Washington's traditional playbook. Coercion only works when dependence is absolute. For decades, the United States occupied the unquestioned center of North American trade. Canada's economy was structured around access to the U.S. market, its industries calibrated to American demand, and its political calculations shaped by the need to avoid retaliation. Tariffs were weapons because they worked. They imposed pain quickly, visibly, and asymmetrically. But the threat now carries a different weight because the conditions that once made it effective have begun to erode. From an economic standpoint, a 100% tariff would not be a surgical strike. It would be a self-inflicted wound. Canada is the United States' largest trading partner, supplying critical inputs across automotive manufacturing, energy, agriculture, lumber, aluminum, and steel. American factories rely on Canadian components that cross the border multiple times before a final product is completed. A sudden tariff shock would ripple through U.S. supply chains, driving up costs, slowing production, and ultimately raising prices for American consumers. Jobs in border states, manufacturing hubs, and logistics corridors would be among the first casualties. Yet the threat was issued anyway. That contradiction points to something more political than economic. Domestically, Trump faces pressure from voters fatigued by instability, from markets increasingly skeptical of tariff-driven strategies, and from allies less willing to absorb unilateral shocks. Internationally, his credibility has been weakened by reversals, erratic messaging, and visible fractures with long-standing partners. In that context, the tariff threat functions less as strategy and more as spectacle, a demonstration of force meant to reassert dominance rather than solve a trade imbalance. The inconsistency is impossible to ignore. Only days earlier, Trump publicly encouraged Canada to pursue trade arrangements with China, calling it a good thing. The substance of Canada's deal did not change. What changed was the stage. Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos reframed tariffs as instruments of coercion and called on middle powers to resist economic intimidation. It was measured, diplomatic, and deliberately non-confrontational, but it landed precisely where it hurt. Authority, once questioned in public, is difficult to reclaim. For American industries, the consequences of escalation would be severe. Automakers, already under pressure from global competition and electrification costs, would face higher input prices and disrupted just-in-time supply chains. Farmers dependent on Canadian fertilizer, energy inputs, or export routes would feel immediate strain. Energy markets tightly linked across the border would experience volatility that no tariff wall can contain. In attempting to punish Canada, the United States risks punishing itself. Politically, the shift from policy argument to personal insult, referring to Canada's Prime Minister as a governor, marked a turning point. When debate gives way to belittlement, it signals the absence of leverage. The message was not aimed at Ottawa alone. It was aimed at a domestic audience, conditioned to equate aggression with strength. But strength in geopolitics is measured by outcomes, not volume. The deeper issue is that tariffs assume a world that no longer fully exists. A world where alternatives are limited and alignment is compulsory. By threatening maximum pressure, Washington revealed its fear that this assumption is no longer safe. Canada's diversification does not weaken the United States by default, but the attempt to block it suggests an anxiety that power is slipping from command to negotiation. This is the paradox now confronting American trade policy. The louder the threat, the clearer the signal that control is no longer guaranteed. And in that realization, the balance of leverage quietly begins to shift. Canada, diversification, defiance, and economic self-determination. For Canada, the tariff threat landed not as a shock, but as confirmation. It validated a strategic shift that had already begun, one rooted in the recognition that dependence is no longer security. For decades, Ottawa accepted asymmetry as the price of stability. The U.S. market was indispensable, retaliation was feared, and deviation was discouraged. That era is now visibly ending. And Canada's response reveals how middle powers adapt when the old guarantees no longer hold. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada's trade posture has changed in tone and substance. The preliminary arrangement with China, limited, targeted, and far from a comprehensive free trade agreement, was designed to stabilize specific sectors rather than signal alignment. Lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for improved access for Canadian canola addressed immediate economic pressures while preserving regulatory control. It mirrored the pragmatic deals the United States itself has struck with Beijing. Yet the reaction from Washington transformed a technical adjustment into a geopolitical litmus test. Economically, Canada's motivation is straightforward. Over-reliance on a single export market creates vulnerability, not efficiency. Supply chain disruptions, tariff shocks, and political volatility over the past decade have exposed the risks of concentration. Diversification is not defiance, it is insurance. By expanding trade channels, Canada reduces the leverage any one partner can exert. That logic underpins its engagement not only with China, but with Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and emerging markets. The positive effects are tangible. Canadian producers gain alternative buyers, stabilizing incomes in agriculture, energy, and advanced manufacturing. Investment flows diversify, reducing exposure to sudden policy shifts south of the border. Domestic innovation benefits as partnerships expand beyond traditional frameworks. For workers, diversification cushions employment against external shocks, preserving livelihoods when a single market tightens access. But the strategy is not without costs or critics. Engagement with China raises legitimate concerns about technology transfer, supply chain security, and political influence. Managing those risks requires strong regulation, transparency, and strategic restraint. Canada's challenge is to extract economic benefit without surrendering control, a balance that demands institutional capacity and political discipline. Critics argue that even limited cooperation can invite pressure. Supporters counter that isolation invites more. The tariff threat sharpened this debate, but it also clarified priorities. Carney's response was not to escalate rhetorically or seek exemptions behind closed doors. Instead, he reframed the issue domestically. Within hours, the message shifted to resilience. Buy Canadian, build Canadian, invest in Canadian workers and technology. This was not symbolism. It was a policy signal. Large-scale housing projects, infrastructure expansion, defense procurement, and industrial policy anchored in domestic materials and labor serve a dual purpose. They stimulate growth while insulating the economy from external coercion. By becoming its own best customer, Canada reduces exposure to tariff shocks without closing itself off. This inward investment does not reject globalization, it rebalances it. For Canadian businesses, the implications are profound. Firms long optimized for U.S. access are now incentivized to innovate for multiple markets. Supply chains are being redesigned with redundancy rather than efficiency alone as the guiding principle. That transition is costly, but it builds long-term stability. For small and medium enterprises, government backing and procurement policies provide a buffer during adjustment. Politically, the response strengthened Canada's position internationally. By refusing to backtrack under pressure, Ottawa signaled credibility to partners watching closely. Middle powers face similar dilemmas worldwide: how to navigate between giants without becoming collateral. Canada's approach, calm, incremental, and grounded in domestic capacity, offers a model that others may quietly emulate. The negative impact of escalation would still be real. Tariffs would hurt exporters, disrupt communities, and strain public finances. But the key shift is psychological. The threat no longer paralyzes decision-making. Canada is not immune, but it is no longer boxed in. In choosing diversification over submission, Canada has altered the equation. Intimidation depends on fear of alternatives. By building them, Canada has reduced that fear, and in doing so, changed the conversation entirely. China and the global system, leverage, perception, and the middle power shift. China occupies a paradoxical position in this confrontation. It is both the stated justification for the tariff threat and, simultaneously, a secondary actor in the immediate exchange. The Canadian-Chinese arrangement at the center of the dispute is narrow in scope, pragmatic in intent, and limited in ambition. Yet its symbolic weight far exceeds its economic size because it reflects a broader shift underway in the global system, one in which middle powers increasingly maneuver between centers of influence rather than orbiting a single one. From Beijing's perspective, Canada represents opportunity without overexposure. Access to Canadian agricultural products such as canola stabilizes supply chains strained by global volatility, while limited entry into Canada's electric vehicle market offers a foothold without provoking direct confrontation. The deal does not signal alliance, it signals transaction. China has pursued similar arrangements worldwide, favoring incremental access over sweeping agreements, especially where political sensitivities are high. The positive effects for China are modest but strategic. Diversified supply reduces dependence on any single exporter, insulating Chinese markets from sanctions or trade disruptions elsewhere. Engagement with Canada also reinforces Beijing's narrative that Western allies are not monolithic and that alternatives to US-centric trade exist. That perception matters. In geopolitics, perception often precedes reality. For the global system, the implications are larger. The dispute exposes how tariffs, once tools of enforcement, are losing effectiveness as economies diversify. Middle powers, Canada, Australia, South Korea, and others, are learning to balance relationships rather than choose sides outright. They cooperate selectively, hedge risk, and invest domestically to offset exposure. This does not weaken the global order. It transforms it. Critics argue that such balancing accelerates fragmentation, creating parallel trade networks and regulatory divergence. That risk is real. Fragmentation can increase costs, complicate compliance, and slow innovation. But the alternative, rigid alignment enforced by threat, has proven equally destabilizing. The global economy is adjusting not because countries want disorder, but because they seek autonomy within interdependence. China benefits from this transition, but it does not control it. Beijing faces its own vulnerabilities, slowing growth, demographic pressure, and external scrutiny. Limited deals with middle powers provide breathing room, not dominance. For Canada, engagement with China is not endorsement, it is optionality. That distinction is central. The negative impact emerges when engagement is misread as capitulation. Washington's reaction illustrates how perception can distort policy. By framing Canada's move as an existential threat, the tariff response elevated China's role beyond reality. In doing so, it inadvertently amplified Beijing's significance and validated its strategy of incremental engagement. For global markets, the episode reinforces uncertainty. Investors respond not only to tariffs enacted, but to threats issued. Volatility increases when rules appear contingent on political emotion rather than process. That uncertainty raises capital costs, dampens long-term planning, and disproportionately affects smaller economies caught in the crossfire. Yet there is also a stabilizing countercurrent. Middle powers coordinating quietly, sharing strategies, diversifying partners, strengthening domestic capacity, reduce the likelihood that any single shock will cascade uncontrollably. Carney's Davos message resonated precisely because it articulated this logic without confrontation. It suggested that the old order of intimidation is giving way to one of resilience. For China, this environment offers access, but also accountability. Engagement with diversified, confident partners comes with conditions, scrutiny, and limits. The days of binary alignment are fading. What replaces them is more complex, less predictable, but arguably more balanced. The tariff threat, intended to reassert control, instead illuminated this transition. It showed that power now lies less in the ability to punish and more in the capacity to adapt. In that shift, China is a participant. but not the driver. The driver is a world recalibrating away from fear as its organizing principle. What this confrontation ultimately reveals is not a trade dispute, but a transition of power. Tariffs, once decisive weapons, now expose the limits of coercion in a diversified world. The negative impacts are real: economic disruption, market uncertainty, and political strain. But so are the solutions. Resilience, domestic investment, and strategic diversification reduce vulnerability without abandoning cooperation. Canada's response shows how middle powers can neutralize pressure by building alternatives rather than reacting to threats. The question now is not who can threaten louder, but who can adapt faster. Viewers should ask, does intimidation still work? Or is this the moment it finally stops?